Okay, today we'll be looking at Michel Foucault. He's really huge. He's a pretty big deal, far beyond international relations, obviously. He's someone who's really worth engaging with, particularly in the context of this course, because a lot of the people we'll be looking at over the following weeks are going to be referring to him or are going to be taking up his ideas in various ways. So he's kind of useful in that regard. It's well worth paying attention and really trying to get Foucault right in your head. He's I think, the most cited modern academic, full stop. Like, I think in the humanities and social sciences, Foucault's cited more than anyone else. You'll be likely to read him in philosophy classes and gender studies classes, critical race classes, media studies, sociology, psychology. He's a big deal. He's pretty much everywhere. So yeah, as I said, he's well worth engaging with. Now today, of course, as usual, we'll briefly look at Foucault as a person. Then we'll be looking first at his idea of power, what power is. Then his method, how he sees power operating in practice. And finally, we'll briefly think about how this applies directly to international relations. All right, so Foucault was born in Poitiers in France in 1926. He attended the École Normale Supérieure and the Sorbonne, where he met Louis Althusser, who is someone who's actually a friend of many of the people we're looking at in this course. He's a structural Marxist. We're not looking at him in this course, but he's kind of connected to a lot of the people we'll be discussing. He worked at the University of Clermont-Ferrand from 1960 to 66. And after this, from 66 to 68, he lectured at the University of Tunis in Tunisia before returning to France, where he became the head of the philosophy department at the new experimental University of Paris 8. In 1970, he was admitted to the Collège de France, a membership he retained until his death. And he was also really, apart from all his academic stuff, he was really active in a number of left-wing groups involved in anti-racist campaigns, anti-human rights abuses, and penal reform. And he's also recognized as one of the most influential campaigners for homosexual rights. Now, Foucault died in Paris in 1984 of neurological problems compounded by HIV/AIDS, and he became the first public figure in France to die from this disease. And his partner, Daniel Defer, founded the AIDS charity in his memory. Okay, now Foucault's work was really focused on the idea of power, particularly in relation to what is referred to as normativity. So normativity refers to the sense of what is normal in society, what's perceived to be the norm, right? What the expected, the natural, the common sense, the regular, just the unnoted kind of stuff. But of course, Foucault points out that if we're going to have a sense of what the normal is, we also need a sense of the concept of abnormality, or the sense of the concept of deviance. And Foucault's work is really focused on the question of how these concepts operate as a matter of power, these concepts of normality and abnormality, or naturalness and deviance. So what do we take to be normal? What do we take to be abnormal? How is this sense of normal produced? And how do we draw the distinction, the barriers between the two? And what does this mean when we do draw this distinction, when we do make this division? And he was also really interested in the ability of the state to produce behavior. And this is really important. This is really central to Foucault's concept of power. So in terms of the particular issues he wrote about in this context, much of his work was interested in the ideas of sexuality and sexual deviancy, and as well mental health. And so, for example, he wrote at length about the role of the asylum in defining what mental illness actually is. And he also wrote about how homosexuality was originally produced as a form of sexual deviance, but that how over time its meaning shifted and it became a possible site of solidarity and of opposition among people included in that group. So that's the general picture, but the big question I want to think about today is what is power? So I want you just to take a moment to think about this. What is power? How do you understand what power is? So please discuss this just for a moment with someone sitting nearby. Yeah. All right, so what is power? What do we mean when we say someone has power or something is powerful?
Influence over someone else.
Okay, so there's influence over someone else. Yep, good. And that's a big one in international relations, right? I guess the idea that power is to make someone do what they otherwise wouldn't have done, right? Yeah. Anything else? No? I mean, yep. The power to what, sorry? To hurt? Okay, yeah. I mean, that's part of it, like kind of the threat of violence or something, right? So this sort of power to dominate is often the way that it's thought about in the context of international relations. The power to make people do what they don't want to do, right? This dominating kind of power. Now, for Foucault, that's not his view at all. He doesn't think that's the right way to think about power, generally speaking. So central to Foucault's idea of power, and possibly his most important contribution to international relations theory, is the idea of power as a productive rather than repressive or constraining or containing kind of force. So he makes sense of this, or expresses this, by contrasting two different images of power. The first is a public execution. So in a public execution, you've got a man executed in the name of the sovereign, and this is an expression of sovereign power, right? The idea of repression, the idea that power works through force and the threat of force. So it tells us what not to do, and it backs up this prohibition with first the threat, and later the actual application of force or of violence. So that's the traditional, that's the classical idea of power. But for Foucault, people aren't worked on by power in this way. And one of the reasons for this is he thinks that we don't actually have a stable us who's then pushed around by power. So in this traditional view, there's this idea that you have the subject of power and the object of power, the person or organization that has the power and the person or organization that's being worked on by power. So the subject's this thing here, and the object's this thing over here. And the subject does things to the object. Foucault, though, there is not this fully formed you who encounters power, who encounters these rules, encounters these strictures, and then has to negotiate them. It's not a situation or a simple situation of subject and object, as if there's, there are these things that just exist in the world. According to Foucault, we're actually produced by power. We're made who we are through and within power. So this is the key idea. Right? For Foucault, power is productive. It's not repressive most of the time. It's not containing most of the time. Doesn't stop you being who you really are. It's not this idea of making you do what you otherwise wouldn't want to do. Real power, the kind of power that Foucault's interested in, and the kind of power that Foucault thinks is interesting and important, doesn't operate in this way. So Foucault's image of power is the second image that he presents, is the prison timetable. Because the prison timetable, it orders the daily activities of prisoners really precisely, right, down to the minute. It includes drills, it includes exercises, roll calls, the labor in the prison workshop. And what's interesting for Foucault about this kind of power is that it isn't actually primarily repressive. So we think, prisons are, of course, they're pretty repressive kinds of places. But Foucault points out that's not exactly what's going on here. Because the power of the prison timetable is also a productive kind of power. It aims to discipline the individual prisoners. It aims to make them a certain way, to turn them into something themselves more useful or more ordered or more efficient. Right? It tries to maximize the productive potential of the prisoners' bodies and of the prisoners' faculties. Now, obviously, when we talk about productive potential, what's productive is a matter of disagreement. We can talk about something being efficient or productive or effective, and this, of course, leaves open the question of what the aims are. Right? So something might be efficient, but we can ask efficient in accomplishing what specifically. Something could be productive. What is it good at producing? Something may be effective. What kind of effects is it actually bringing about? But regardless, we can think of power as normalizing the people that it's disciplining. So power has this particular idea, or particular ideal perhaps, of how a human individual should be, and it aims to make people into that ideal. So this kind of power, it doesn't rest on the assumption that we're these fully formed objects that power can operate on. Rather, disciplinary power operates by making us into a certain kind of person. It actually works by constructing who we are to begin with. Right, so traditional models of power is this idea that it's something that's imposed from on high. A ruler or a sovereign or a master, they impose it, they exercise it on the people below them. So power is something that people hold, and they use it to control other people through this repressive kind of mechanism. And Foucault just says, no, that's not right. His idea of power, he suggests, is more flexible, and it accounts for the much more diverse ways that power works than this pretty simple repressive model. This kind of power, he thinks, can be described as relying on what he calls technologies of power. So his idea is, for power to work, it relies on a whole series of technical knowledges about various things. It needs to know about the body, right, how the body functions. It needs to know how human beings can be organized productively. It needs to know all these kinds of techniques and technologies for modifying people, how they can be modified and what they can ultimately do and how they can ultimately be organized for its own particular aims. Okay, so again, power is productive. And in particular, Foucault draws attention to the fact that it produces knowledge. It produces categories, it produces rituals, and most importantly, he thinks it produces reality. So power is not the ability to tell people what to do. Rather, it's the ability to decide on and to define the categories and the concepts that make up our lives. So we can think about this in terms of sort of the university context, in terms of the disciplines, the different ways that we can apportion academic thought. So we've got international relations, we've got history, we've got media studies, philosophy, and so on, right? Each of these disciplines is seen to be a correct place where knowledge can be performed. But as we take on these disciplines, we also lose certain things. And the questions and the debates and the ideas that don't fit within these categories, that don't belong to these particular disciplines, they tend to get less money, they tend to get less attention, they get less respect, less resources, less teaching. So on the one hand, to be aligned with a discipline is to have a certain power, it's to have a certain solidity, because these are things that are recognized. It's to have sort of rituals and categories that define the way things are, that define you. And it helps you gather material wealth and power in society and so on. So power is, in this context, a matter of deciding on what concepts, what categories are the real ones. It decides how the world is broken up, it decides how the world is divided, it decides how the world is made sense of. And the way we do this ends up having real effects on the world. So it's not just this idle thing, it's not just a matter of having a particular theory or perspective on the way the world works. It's deciding on concepts and categories in a way that makes certain things count and other things not count, right? It ends up structuring the way that the world actually works through these concepts and through these categories. And so this production of concepts and categories, the production of knowledge, Foucault thinks is one of the most important operations of power. Okay, so again, Foucault really dwells on this question of power. And in some ways, some of his writing is like this giant dictionary definition, because it constantly tries to define the meaning of this term, but never kind of rests completely. It's an ongoing kind of thing. And actually this, in the context of Foucault, is actually really important, because, as I said, he's really interested in the way that definitions construct our world. Definitions, they have the power to let us imagine certain things, and they also prevent us from imagining other things. So this concept of power that's beyond domination, he thinks that power as domination, it's actually just not very interesting. It's kind of obvious, and it's not actually the most pervasive or important form of power that exists. It's not the power that governs our everyday life. It's not the kind of power that fully permeates our society. And he does think, of course, that the power of domination does exist, but he thinks it's pretty rare. And he thinks if we focus on this kind of power, we miss most of the actual uses of power that occur in the world. So one of the key features of this disciplinary kind of power for Foucault is that it isn't, as I've said, exercised from above, but actually it arises from all of us. It comes from below. Because if disciplinary power, is about us becoming certain kinds of people, and in turn, disciplining others, because we have certain ideas about how people should be and how the world should work, we don't get a pyramid kind of model of power. Instead, we get a model in which everyone is linked to everyone else, and everyone has actually their own power. Everyone's kind of a node of power. Everyone's a subject of power, rather than merely being an object of power. And so we're constantly, all of us, exerting this disciplinary power on each other pretty much all of the time. So he thinks a better model than the pyramid, in terms of thinking about how power works, is a network. So something like this. The power operates through networks. It operates through everyone exerting power on everyone else. And as a consequence of this, power is ultimately always local. So we can't think of power as this massive force that kind of bears down on us from above or from outside of us. Instead, if power is this thing that's distributed through a network, then power is going to be located always at each node. So it's always going to be located locally. It's not going to be this distant thing, but it's actually going to be this small local thing, small local operation. And of course as well, it's going to be unstable, because again, if we're all part of this network of power, then we all have the ability to influence the distribution of this power. We all ultimately have power. We all have this ability to produce the world around us through quite local contestations of ideas and concepts and categories, through local disagreements about meaning and about identity. So power is not this uniform, stable force that operates on us. Instead, it's this really unstable, constantly shifting field of power that changes locally due to local operations of power, local ways of thinking, local categorizations and disciplines. So, it's not a matter of the sovereign saying, this is the case and this is not the case. We're all participants in these relations of power. We're all affected by the disciplinary power that operates on us locally, and we in turn reproduce or alter those relations of power through our own activity. And again, this happens locally, right? What is and what isn't, the categories, the identities, the concepts that we use to make sense of the world and that condition the way the world works, are always produced locally, and they're always shifting and changing depending on who you're with and where you are and what the particular context is. So one of the main points here is therefore that power is not something that you can just hold, right? You can't take away someone's power, and you can't say that a particular person has all the power. Power can't be taken away from a person. It's not something that you can hold in your hand like in this case. And the reason for this is that power is something that's innate to every particular relationship. Because again, if power is a network, if it's not a pyramid, then it's actually the connections between these nodes that power inheres in. So I said before, power was kind of in the nodes. It's not strictly true, because if power was in the nodes, if power was in the individuals, then power would be something that you could possess. But instead, power is this thing that comes out of, that exists as part of our relationship to others. And relationships are always two-way, right? No relationship is constituted wholly by one party or the other party. They're always something that is both part of us and outside us at the same time. So while we all have the power to modify the relationships in this network of power, of which we're all a part, we do this through modifying the relationships between us and others, by modifying these categories and these concepts and so on that structure these relationships through this process of contestation about what is, about what counts, and how we should think about what counts. Right, so we don't possess power then. Power is in these relationships, and these relationships ultimately constitute who we are. But of course, these relationships are also not completely out of our control. On the other hand, they're not entirely within our control. But if the disciplinary power that operates on us is only maintained through our reproducing that power in our local relationships, then we're always able to resist this disciplinary power to a certain extent. And this is something I really want to emphasize. So power is not a pyramid. We don't do most of what we do in our daily lives because some force bearing down on us telling us what to do, right? I'm sure you don't recognize that kind of model in understanding your own behavior in your day-to-day lives. Instead, as a network, power is distributed through this network, and so we have power operating locally in that network, and that power is reproduced locally and it spreads out locally. Now, if an entire society operates according to the same logic, if it seems that the disciplinary power of a certain kind operates across an entire society, that isn't because the members of that society have been disciplined from above, but because that disciplinary power has spread out and been reproduced from person to person. So the way of categorizing and conceptualizing the world that underlies that disciplinary power has been reproduced by local relationships repeatedly, so that it's ended up spreading out and structuring a whole society. But of course, thinking of things in this way, this means that the disciplinary power is never able to hold a completely firm grip on any society, because if it needs to be constantly reproduced locally through this whole society in order to structure that society, then of course that power, those concepts, those categories, those identities can always be disrupted locally as well. On top of this, this power is never going to be faithfully reproduced through the whole society. So this discourse, for example, of disciplinary power, a way of thinking about, a way of conceptualizing and categorizing the world that spreads out through this network, is always going to be modified locally. It's never going to be uniform through the whole society. And in fact, it has to, it can only operate locally, right? And so this means it's always going to be resisted locally in various different ways. So the discourse is always going to be modified locally due to these various different kinds of resistances. So the idea here is that the attempt or the possibility of refuting power, the possibility of standing against power, destabilizing power is always present at every moment. As soon as you attempt to exercise power in any kind of context, anytime you try to lay down a certain rule or a certain understanding, a certain concept, anytime you try to convince people to behave in a certain kind of way, anytime you propagate a discourse about how things are, how things work, how the world is, then there's going to be resistance against that. And that resistance always happens at multiple points. So we've had models before where we've got this really big push and pull between two opposing forces. So maybe we've got like the left and the right in politics, or we've got the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And these models see conflict in societies being a fight over power between these two different groups. But for Foucault's model, we actually have lots of different opposing forces, constantly destabilizing a particular discourse, constantly questioning discourse in different ways, and always doing so locally. So a particular discourse about anything is constantly, locally being resisted, and it's being resisted not in terms of this massive push and pull between these two forces, but instead it's being resisted constantly in this myriad of different ways, different small ways, these local underminings, these local modifications, these local questionings of this particular discourse. Now as well, because the discourse itself is only reproduced locally, we can only resist the discourse ultimately locally. But the idea is there isn't this, we don't want to have this picture of local resistance against some big, overwhelming kind of force, some overwhelming kind of power. Local resistance resists power and resists discourses of power at this kind of, at a local level, and always in very small ways. And the discourse itself is always reproduced in small ways at the local level. Okay, all right. So Foucault, to try and give you a better sense of how power works here, because I know it's still a bit confusing, Foucault has 4 basic rules about how power operates, and these constitute his understandings of how power works in practice. I'm going to go through each of these in turn. The first is his rule of imminence. So this is the idea that power is always imminent, it's always there, it's always existing in every moment. So it's not this thing that has the separate existence, that exists outside of the things that it's operating on. It's always within them, and it's constantly operating. It never rests. And because of this, categories, subjects, identities only exist for Foucault insofar as they're subjects of power. So something is only a category, something is only an object, because it's been established as such by these relationships, by these discourses of power. So think about it like this. If discourses, if categories and concepts and objects are the operations of power, then we can't separate disciplinary power from these objects, from these categories, from these identities themselves. Power is immanent in them. Power is inside them all the time. And this is one reason why, for Foucault, knowledge is power. Of course, this is a common phrase. Foucault means actually something very different from what we commonly take that phrase to mean. Usually we think, all right, knowledge is power in the sense that the more you know, the more you can do, right? If you know about how the world works, then you can change the world, you can blah, blah, blah. It's kind of Adorno's sense of power here, or instrumental reason. Foucault's understanding of the phrase, as I said, completely different. For Foucault, knowledge literally is power, and power literally is knowledge. Because discourses function by creating our knowledge, they create our categories, they create our concepts, and they create the objects in the world. And power is it's part of this, it's immanent in this operation. So the creation of knowledge is an operation of power, and power, or at least disciplinary power, is itself nothing but this certain knowledge of the world, this certain understanding of the world. So power is always going to be present at every moment. But really importantly too, nothing can ever be outside power. Because if you're outside power, then you don't even exist. Right? If power creates, or rather if power is, the categories and the concepts and the objects that make up our world, then to be outside of power is just to be unrecognized as a concept or a category or an object. And if you're unrecognized, then you're not really real. So power is always present in every situation. It's completely immanent in the world all the time. Now, it's important to note here, what I'm not saying is that things disappear in a puff of smoke if we're not around, or if power doesn't say that they exist. So if power decided that this wasn't a coffee cup, it's not going to disappear. So, if I'm going to say power creates objects, for example, I'm not saying that this lecture theatre, as a physical object, is going to disappear if power doesn't recognize its existence. Like, that would be ridiculous, right? But the fact is that this lecture theatre is actually just a clump of matter. It's just a bunch of stuff, right? Arranged in a particular kind of way. And that, without us, that's all it is. It's just a bunch of matter arranged in a particular kind of way. It's meaningless, it's mute, it's just completely raw matter. But we, of course, we don't encounter this lecture theatre as a raw lump of matter. We encounter it as a lecture theatre, right? And to be a lecture theatre, rather than just a random lump of matter, we have to invest it with the concept of lecture theatre. We have to understand it as a lecture theatre. So we have to have this concept, we have to have the various categorizations, the various understandings that make that concept possible, that make that concept meaningful. Otherwise, it could be something else entirely. We could think of it not as a lecture theatre, but, gosh, I don't know, a movie theatre, or I have no idea. But the point is, without our conceptualizing it, without our applying a category to it and thinking about it in a certain way, it's not a lecture theatre, it's just itself, it's just a thing. So the fact that this is a lecture theatre instead of something else is because of a particular discourse, it's because of a particular system of knowledge, a system of categorization that codes it as a lecture theatre for us. So because of that, power is immanent even in the everyday objects that we encounter in our lives. So it's immanent in everything around us all the time, this power knowledge. We can never escape it, we can never get outside this kind of power. Okay, secondly, we have the rule of continual variation. And what this means is that power relations are always shifting. They're never stabilized in one direction, but they can shift and change, and do shift and change over time. And this is something we've discussed a bit already. So power, operates locally in a network, and so it can never be this one-way process. It's never stable. Instead, power and discourses of power, they're constantly shifting, they're constantly being pushed and pulled from various different directions, all at the same time. So categorizations and conceptualizations, discourses that give certain people or certain groups a dominant position in a relationship at one moment, they can be altered in the next moment, and they can even be flipped around entirely. So no relations of power, no discourses are ever settled, and they can change from moment to moment. So the rule of double conditioning, it's kind of opposed, draws attention to the idea that we can't take off a particular structure and impose it on a different context, sort of a structure of power or a discourse of power. But nevertheless, different discourses can relate to each other. So one example could be in the context of a father figure in a family according to certain discourses. You've got this kind of model for how the family works, and you've got the father in a sort of patriarchal view at the top. And it wouldn't be correct to say that this is just a micro version of the king and the state, right? There are differences between these two levels, the family and the state, that means we miss a lot of important stuff. But it's important to note that the function of one of these positions, or both of these positions, do actually relate to the function of the other. So the father figure is not the equivalent of the king, but both the father figure and the king figure have this idea that in all cases we have to have someone who makes the final decision. And this means that the idea of the father in this patriarchal system and the idea of the king in a kind of a feudal system or whatever, they end up supporting each other in practice. They end up reinforcing each other because they have underneath them the same kind of function, the same idea of how relationships ought to be structured. So they reinforce each other in discourse. And so for Foucault, we really need to pay attention and look out for these kinds of connections. So even though we can't say that they're exactly the same kind of thing, we do need to think about how different things in a discourse, different levels of power, or different operations of power, while being importantly different in many ways, nevertheless act to reinforce each other in this kind of way. So in other words, operations of power and knowledge, as expressed in discourses, are never just isolated operations. Always the various aspects of a discourse, the various categories, the various concepts, the various objects that they create, exist in these mutually reinforcing relationships. And this is one reason why certain discourses can be so powerful. They can spread and they can reproduce from node to node in a particular network so easily, and appear from our point of view to exist as these seemingly permanent or seemingly seemingly permanent kind of structures. Because these discourses, they're always being resisted. I've said, discourses are always resisted in a whole lot of different ways at local levels. But because of this rule of double conditioning, when you undermine one aspect of a discourse in isolation at a local level, it ends up being reinforced by these other aspects of this other discourse, right? So this means that this dominant discourse, it has just an easier time pushing back against this resistance because it can draw on the resources of these mutually reinforcing discourses. But the local resistance, by contrast, it doesn't have the ability to do this. It doesn't have this mutually reinforcing structure to draw upon in its resistance. And this might be, interestingly, I think, a way of thinking about the operations of hegemony and counter-hegemony in Gramsci, right? And why the hegemonic worldview always has the advantage over the counter-hegemonic worldview because of these mutually reinforcing discourses, this rule of double conditioning. Okay, this final rule, this fourth rule, is potentially the most important. And I think this rule really brings to the forefront Foucault's idea of discourse. So discourse, I've used the word a lot. Basic idea is it's Foucault's word for how we discuss something such that what we discuss ends up being produced by power. So we discuss things in a certain way, we produce knowledge, and in doing so we produce power, we produce reality. So the categories, the theories, the models that we have for understanding our world, all of these are products of power, and so these theories and models are, he calls them discourses. Importantly though, discourses, they don't just exploit people. So one way you could think of it is these discourses are just ways of people controlling other people, of keeping other people down. But they don't just do this. They work actually in multiple kinds of ways. Because as soon as you define something, if you define, say, the parameters of an argument, or you make a particular interpretation, or you invent a particular kind of category, then that can actually be used against you. And so Foucault's example of this that he often uses is the naming of the homosexual subject. So Foucault suggests that in the classical context, homosexual behavior was just that, it was just behavior. So you could do homosexual things, but there wasn't an identity of being a homosexual. The idea in the classical context, and he talks about ancient Greece, it didn't make sense. It wasn't a category. It didn't exist as a thing. Because he thinks, of course, to be able to be homosexual, you need that concept, you need that category, you need that identity. It has to be a real thing, or a real concept or an identity that exists in a particular kind of discourse. Without the concept, then there's no homosexual subject. There's homosexuality, but there's no thing that is called being a homosexual. Now, we had, in the modern period, we had the rise of this modern policing of sexuality, and in this context, the idea of the homosexual person arises, right? And it becomes possible at that point to be a homosexual person. It becomes a certain type of person. And it becomes possible to identify or be identified as a homosexual. Now, of course, for those who initially defined this concept, who defined the object, who defined the identity of the homosexual person in this way, from their point of view, they were defining homosexuality as a deviant identity. That was how it operated as a discourse initially. But of course, as soon as it became possible to be a homosexual person, even if originally being so was considered to make you an outcast, to make you a deviant, it then became possible to have solidarity based on that aspect of your identity. So the idea here is once this definition is made, once that concept is created, once that identity is created by these discourses of power, the power of that definition ends up escaping those who make that definition initially, right? And so this definition, in many ways, empowered homosexual people, because without that solidarity, a solidarity that, again, was only made possible because of the creation of this concept of homosexuality to begin with, even though the creation of that concept involved coding homosexual people as deviant initially, without that concept, you can't say fight for homosexual rights. You can't do that if you don't have first the idea of the homosexual subject. Because you can't fight to be something, or the right to be something, in law and so on, if there's no conception of being that thing as an identity to begin with. So the idea here is that the first definition of homosexuality, of the homosexual subject, was completely intended to oppress people and to discipline people. It was intended to make them act in certain ways. But, as we can see now, that definition has been turned back against the people who want to use it to oppress, and is now a source of power and a source of solidarity and possibility and pride. So this is the flexibility of discourse in Foucault's view. This is its changing nature. It can never be just a one-way process. So discourses, they get created, but once they're created, they're outside of the full control of the people who create them. They go out into this network, this really distributed network, and they're changed. They're changed locally and perhaps more than locally. And they can be modified in various different ways, and they can be completely turned around. They can be flipped. So things that were once oppressive end up being emancipatory. So the very concepts, the very categorizations of those discourses can be turned against the views of those who created them to begin with. Okay. I mean, any discussion of power, I think, is kind of automatically relevant to international relations, but here are some more specific applications of this idea to international relations itself. I think one pretty obvious application is that this understanding of power undermines traditional IR's interest in sovereignty and in sovereign power. Now, of course, Foucault's not going to say that this top-down power ceases to exist. This power to dominate, it still exists, but it just doesn't matter as much as we thought it does for our understanding of international politics. Because this bottom-up power, this disciplinary power, the power of discourses distributed through this network, that's just more prevalent, it's more pervasive. It's just the power that is part of our everyday lives and part of most of what goes on in society and in politics. So it's far more important, Foucault thinks, to understand this kind of power if we want to understand how things work, right? This minor, ultimately, it has a role, this dominating kind of power, but ultimately it's minor. And the idea of the sovereign is really just not as important for understanding the way the world works as we thought it was. Now, because this form of disciplinary power is expressed and created in discourses, then we should be examining discourses if we want to understand how the world works. But of course, since power always operates locally, it's actually not as important to look at the discourses, to look at the ways of speaking and thinking, the kind of categorizations and identities and conceptualizations of those at the top of society, right? That's fine. We can analyze the talk, the discourses of world leaders. There's nothing wrong with that. But for Foucault, according to this view, it's just as useful to analyze the kinds of everyday discourses that occur between perfectly ordinary kinds of people. They're just as relevant to international relations as the discourses of world leaders. And in fact, doing this is going to teach us just as much, it's going to teach us maybe even more than analyzing the discourses of so-called important people. Because when it comes to disciplinary power, it's a network. There's no center. It needs to be continually reproduced from node to node, from moment to moment. So it doesn't make sense to privilege the discourses of those at the top over those at the bottom. Because without a center, without a periphery, no one is actually ultimately more important than anyone else when it comes to understanding how power works and how discourses are spread and reproduced through a particular society. We can also turn this kind of discourse analysis to IR theories themselves, and particularly we can turn them on dominant theories such as realism. So if reality is constituted by these discourses, by these categorizations, these conceptualizations that are themselves operations of power, then realism is also an operation of power that creates a certain kind of reality. So we can ask, how does realism operate to create a certain kind of world? We can ask how the knowledge that realism produces, because it claims to produce knowledge, right? The whole point of realism is that it tells us about the world. We can ask, well, how does that knowledge actually produce itself acts of power? Like, how does that operate on the world? How does that make the world a certain kind of way? Now, importantly too, since disciplinary power is reproduced from moment to moment, as I've said, at this local level, there's also no point in looking at discourses ahistorically or acontextually. So we don't ask, how does realism, generally speaking, act as a discourse of power? Rather, we ask, how does realism act at a particular moment in time, in a particular context, as a discourse of power? That's what we need to do. Because for Foucault, there are just no general answers. When we're talking about discourses, there are no general answers, because everything is constantly reproduced locally in local contexts, right? We can only ever have, therefore, local answers and contextual answers. And if you try to do anything more than this, then you're just mistaking the way that power and knowledge actually work. You're treating them as the stable and structural and objective and centralized things, rather than local, unstable, distributed, and constantly changing from moment to moment. Okay, that's us for today. Perfect timing. Next, on Thursday, we'll look at yet another Frenchman, Gilles Deleuze, who is pretty different, but pretty interesting. As I